And don't blame me, I'm just reporting. Sometimes when you tell people the truth, they act like you're doing something. I'm reporting. I want to talk this morning about chickens come home to roost. Our scripture is from the book of Galatians, chapter 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. You reap what you sow. Now, chickens come home to roost is an old saying. It's based on the daily behavior of chickens. They wake up in the morning and go out and search for food all day long. They eat almost anything. Then at the end of the day, the chickens always, no matter what, come back home to rest as the sun goes down. The saying, chickens come home to roost, means that the consequences of wrongdoing always catch up with the wrongdoer. The Bible says the same thing in a different way. It says, you reap what you sow. That means you're going to harvest whatever kind of seeds you've been sowing. You're going to get back what you give out. And that is exactly what's happening in white America in recent years. I want to explore this phenomenon so that we might be better able to deal with the dramatic changes occurring in our midst and understand what they mean for our collective future. On the Sunday before the Iowa caucus, Bill Clinton stood up in the Corinthian Baptist Church in Des Moines, Iowa, to campaign for his wife, Hillary, in her bid to become the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States. And he spoke words that are talked about in private, but rarely are they uttered in the light of day, and never in a public event that is predominantly black. He rose to explain why there is so much widespread anger among white Americans. He said, and I quote, white Americans have realized that we are going to have to share the future. The only question is, what will be the terms of that sharing? Unquote. He was trying to explain that the anger that had suddenly erupted in the election season had its roots in white people's rejection of the direction of the country and its institutions, which had become more tolerant and accepting of different kinds of people. A demographic tsunami has altered the American landscape seemingly overnight. The country has become younger, darker, more diverse, more liberal, and even anti-capitalist. The bad behavior of banks has driven a generation of young white people to be against capitalism. Exorbitant student loans, leaving them hopelessly in debt. Bailing out banks that's doing crazy kind of speculation has soured them on capitalism. And so what they think are the pillars of the country have been rejected by a generation of their own children. In his book, Brown is the New White, Steve Phillips says, each day the size of the United States population increases by more than 8,000 people. And almost 90% of that growth consists of people of color. 8,000 people a day, 90% of them people of color. He contrasts that with in 1950, the United States population was 90% white. That's Turner Classic Movies world. You know, you look at the movies and when there is a black person, they carrying luggage or bringing a sandwich. In 1950, it was 90% white. As a result, the over 65 segment of the population today is 78% white. Out of this over 65 segment, 7,000 people die per day. This means that births in America are overwhelmingly people of color, and deaths are overwhelmingly people who categorize themselves as white. And the idea of having to negotiate the terms of sharing America's future is, for most white Americans, totally unacceptable. They can't face it, can't deal with it, can't wrap their mind around it. This Southern awareness has thrown white America into a collective nervous breakdown. They want their country back. That is the expression of a frustration. That country hasn't gone anywhere, but it's the expression of a psychology that we are losing control. We don't have control, but they're losing control. They feel that the American dream is over. There's a deep fear of losing white supremacy and white privilege. And these are the principal pillars undergirding white American self-esteem. White people's self-esteem rests on the fact that I am a part of a supreme group, and that I have privilege in this society. I have preferential treatment. I'm given the benefit of the doubt. And so it's not just the political fact of that's the way the society works. It's also the psychological reality that that's what their self-esteem rests on. I'm better than you. I don't care how much you got or what you do. I'm better than you. And that brings solace and comfort even in their darkest hours. So there's a sadness and disappointment pervading white America that is so profound that it's more like a broken heart. A recent New York Times article by Gina Colada said, and I quote, "Something startling is happening to middle-aged white Americans. Unlike every other age group, unlike every other racial and ethnic group, unlike their counterparts in other rich countries, death rates in this group have been rising, not falling. The reasons for this rise are suicide, alcoholism, and drug overdoses. But these white Americans are really dying of a broken heart." Unquote. These broken hearts are the result of the unraveling and of the mythological version of American history that we've been taught, that is built on the myth of white supremacy and the expectation of white privilege. And you know, if you build something on a lie, on a crooked foundation, over a period of time it's going to be destabilized, come unbalanced, and it's going to fall to the ground. You reap what you sow. To explain this fully, I got to teach you a little history. Is that all right? In 1675, a little known, well-publicized event occurred that shaped our experience to this very day. A man by the name of Nathaniel Bacon of Jamestown, Virginia, recognized that black slaves, white indentured servants, and poor whites shared pretty much the same material conditions. Only the landowners who had been given vast land tracts by the King of England had any chance of prospering in the New World. So he organized a rebellion to secure new lands that could be distributed to those without land. The landowners didn't want to lose their labor force, so they fought to put down rebellion. The fighting was so fierce that the governor of Virginia fled for his life while his capital burned to the ground. And the King of England had to dispatch 1,000 of his best troops to put down the rebellion. And after terrible fighting came to an impasse, They negotiated a settlement. The rebels were promised freedom and land. But as soon as they put their arms down, the landowners reneged on their promises and hung the leaders of the rebellion and put the black slaves back in chains. But this threat of unity among slaves, indentured servants, and poor whites scared landowners to death. And in order to make sure that it didn't happen again, they decided that from now on, only to import slaves directly from Africa to make sure they didn't speak English, because they had been getting them from the islands where they were seasoned, and they had learned to speak English and learned to talk to each other because they were from different places in Africa. They had learned to communicate with each other. And so now they said, we're only going to import slaves directly from Africa. And secondly, they gave poor whites and indentured servants a social promotion. They included them in the privileged class. In other words, they created a new category of citizen that has never existed in the history of the world. They created white people. Now, as members of the privileged class, poor whites were expected to help the landowners maintain the slave population. And they took turns on duty, being the paddy rollers or the slave patrollers that marched up and down the roads at night to make sure that no slave had escaped. If they found somebody, they beat them to death. They were part of law enforcement. This is why when they passed the Constitution, they said, we got to pass this thing about the right of regular people to carry arms. It was so that they could protect themselves. Landowners created whiteness by making poor whites a part of the American aristocracy. At the same time, they declared black people inferior, subhuman, and removed us from the human family altogether in a very elaborate process that is called animalization, the science of turning a human being into an animal. They created an America rooted in the idea of white supremacy. And over time, this idea became so ingrained in American culture that it became a kind of religion. A religion. When you believe something so deeply that it exists beyond question or beyond doubt, it's a faith. This faith became racism, the core faith of American civilization. From that day to this one, racism has shaped American life more than any other value. It's older than democracy and has more impact than Christianity. It's a civilization built on a crooked foundation, on a lie. See, whiteness is a construct. It is a human construct. It's something made up, deliberately created to facilitate a system of racial capitalism that is designed to maximize the exploitation of black people. Whiteness is not real. There are no white people. Throughout history, there's never been a mention of any such person. Throughout history, there are no mention of white people. They were Greeks, they were Romans, they were Gauls, they were Slavs, they were Scottish, they were Irish, they were Jewish, they were Italian, they were Anglo, they were Saxons, they were Normans, they were Scandinavians, and they were Nordics. But there wasn't any white people. But to participate in the global conspiracy of slavery, all of these disparate tribes were whitewashed and brought under the common banner of whiteness. This conspiracy brought untold riches and benefits to the entire white world and spelled disaster and suffering for the entire black world. Edward E. Baptist, in his book, the half that has never been told. Says, and I quote, "The idea that the commodification and suffering and forced labor of African Americans is what made the United States powerful and rich is not an idea that people necessarily are happy to hear. Yet it is the truth, and that truth was the half of the story that's never been told." Unquote. Throughout American history, the whiteness construct has been used to maintain a system of white supremacy. And a tiny, tiny ruling class has skillfully used the construct of whiteness to control the white masses and preserve their power position. After the Revolutionary War that established America as a country, the 55 landowners who formulated the Constitution were not going to share their wealth and power with the people that fought the war. But what they offered them was a kind of social currency, a kind of consolation prize called white privilege. The opportunity to participate in a package of unearned benefits. Unearned benefits. Society is granting you benefits that you didn't earn. You're getting by virtue of the fact that you were born with white pigment. Unearned benefits and advantages that non-white people did not share. It included freedom, unjust enrichment, special advantages, guaranteed opportunities, inalienable rights, and a playing field tilted in their favor. And it was determined in order for this system to continue to work in perpetuity, America had to be committed to always being a white country. Which is why all the immigrants that came into this country up until the 1960s were white. All the immigrants that came into the country were white people. They were the Jews. They were the Italians. They were the Irish. There wasn't any great flood of people from Africa or from Jamaica. They were trying to make sure that the balance always stayed where it was a predominantly white country. Everybody else was a resident alien. We lived here, worked here, but the laws didn't apply to us the same way. We were not citizens. From the very beginning, America was never intended to be a pure democracy. It was a democracy at the top. This tiny group of people, tiny ruling elite, people of wealth, status, education, and influence and power, held together by common interests and intermarriage, have always run America, and they established a form of government to ensure that they always would. The Constitution breaks up power so that nobody can do anything. How can a few senators, congressmen, keep a Supreme Court justice from being voted on? That's the way it's designed. It's designed so that no one person can come do anything. There's always checks and balances, and if the Congress goes crazy, and if the president is crazy, there's always the Supreme Court to declare it unconstitutional and send us right back to zero. It's a cartel. It's set up to keep power in the hands of very, very few people, and to make sure that the aristocratic patricians, the patricians, the rich people, they have the positions of power, and they make the decisions about the country. This tiny ruling elite expanded and sharpened the concept of whiteness, and they used it as a weapon, as a means to control their power positions by manipulating the white masses with threats to their white privilege. And that's the history of America. They manipulate them with threats of losing their white privilege, and they go crazy. For the first 60 years of America's history, the ruling elite existed in basic agreement. Everything went good. They were cool with each other about the direction of the country. Whenever they had disagreements, they could hammer them out inside closed doors. But the issue of slavery divided the ruling elites like anything before. The ruling elites of the North wanted more customers to buy their products, and the South wanted more slaves to produce their cotton, which at that time was the most profitable commodity in the world. Southern United States was the Saudi Arabia of the 1800s. Most of the millionaires in this country were not in New York or Boston or Philadelphia. They were in the Mississippi Delta. Slaves in 1860 America were the #1 resource in the country, worth more than $3 billion. More than all the factories, all the railroads, all the banks, all the agriculture, more than all the worth of the rest of the total American economy combined. The most important thing in America was slaves. And when they wanted to build a new slave labor camp, after running the Indians out of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, they marched slaves across the country, and they used the slaves as mortgage to get loans from the bank to build these big plantations. The slaves had value, in fact, had more value than any other thing in the country. Cotton production not only required large amounts of slave labor, it also wore out the land, which is why the United States started on the East Coast and kept moving west. It had to move west to find new land to plant cotton. That land out there wasn't just empty. It had Indians out there. And the army had to move them out of the way. Send them to Arkansas and Arizona and New Mexico and Oklahoma. So cotton production kept moving west. They even had plans to build a slave and cotton empire all the way down through Mexico, down through Latin America, all the way to South America. That's why they were so confident that they could win a war, because they said the world needs cotton, and we're the only one that got it. And they're going to come to our aid in a time of crisis. See, only about 7,000 plantation owners in the South really cared about the slavery issue. 7,000 plantation owners. But by telling the people of the South that freed subhuman black slaves were going to take their jobs, take over their businesses, marry their daughters, violate their customs and traditions in their venerated Christian way of life, and literally wipe out whiteness through race mixing, and turn all Americans into niggers. So the white masses were duped into fighting to protect the interests of the ruling class in the Civil War under the guise of saving Dixie. This was the same strategy that led to Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. In order to maintain their cheap labor force, Jim Crow laws turned private slaves owned by a master into public slaves owned by a society. You understand that? Private slaves owned by a master into public slaves owned by a society. If you were born before 1964, you were a public slave. There were places you couldn't go. There were things you couldn't do. They wasn't going to tell you where to sleep, what to eat, and all that, because you had your own little section of town. They gave you a little money, you fed yourself, you took care of yourself, you took care of your children, and then you came to work for them. I don't care if it was in a plantation picking cotton in Georgia or if it was Ford Motor Company in Rubber Road. It was turned private slaves owned by a master into public slaves owned by a society. And all white people benefited from this arrangement. By 1900, there were 5 times more black people in debt slavery, sharecropping, than there had been in chattel slavery before the Civil War. And this same logic of playing the race card to manipulate the racism of the white masses was used during the labor struggles, where workers fighting for wages and rights was aborted by the fact that the white folks wanted higher wages, but they didn't want to join together with black people. They didn't want black people to get higher wages, so they denied them to themselves by not joining together. And their inability to unify blocked union organization for decades. This same strategy of manipulating the white masses was used during the New Deal. Policies that were intended to save capitalism during the Great Depression were used by the Southern elites to facilitate the greatest white supremacy social engineering project in history. You know, all the money that was supposed to take care of people, it's supposed to be given out by the government to take care of people. In the South, that's not the way they used it. They made white superiority appear to be real by diverting government funds from helping all people to using them only to help white people. They gave them the best schools, the best neighborhoods, the best loans and grants to start businesses, the best home mortgages, great colleges with free tuition, all to create a material distinction between white people and black people. Before that, the material conditions between white people and black people, there was none. The only benefit they had was that they were white. But their floors were made of dirt just like ours was made of dirt. But within 2 generations of this arrangement, they transformed dirt-poor, ignorant white farmers into the educated, professional, business, and country club class of the South. And this made them even more loyal and invested in maintaining the Southern way of life and the privileges that they enjoyed because of it. You don't have to believe me. Look up a book called When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. You get it from the white man, you believe it. Anyway, I'm going someplace with this. After World War II, virtually the whole white population was lifted into a secure middle-class existence. You know how you look at old TV programs, their houses mysteriously didn't look like ours. They had things in there that we didn't have in our houses. They were living on another level. And that was true after World War II of virtually the whole white population. They had billboards on the side of the road that boasted, America, the highest standard of living in the world. The new superpower status of America made it possible for it to shower benefits on those who helped win the war. And the American dream of constant generational upward mobility was now more than a hope. It was an expectation. Everybody expected to do better than their daddy did. It was more than a privilege. It was now a right. And if I don't do better than my father, then something is wrong. Even the Irish and the Italians and the Jews who had not up to this point been considered white were now invited into the whiteness fellowship. You ever wonder why all the gangsters were Irish, Jewish, and Italian? Because before World War I, they were locked out just like black people. And the reason for that is, in the case of the Italians and the Jews, was history was replete with references to them having way too much African blood to be considered white. After World War II, the American ruling elites were no longer rulers of a backwater country where nobody cared about how they treated their citizens. Up until World War II, nobody cared about what the United States did. It didn't matter. But when it became a superpower, everybody was watching. They were center stage rulers of the world. And they were competing with Russia, the only other superpower, for the loyalty of other countries of the world, the majority of which were non-white. To be successful in their world leadership role, America was forced to clean up its act, at least on the outside. The civil rights struggle skillfully exploited this situation by making the United States look bad in the eyes of the world. They wanted you to beat them. They wanted it filmed, and they wanted it to go around the world because it was undermining United superpower competition with Russia and knew that it was going to bring some concessions about. And that public relations struggle that they had forced many white Americans to face the contradictions inherent in a racist society. They actually believed in the stated American ideals of fairness, freedom, justice, and equal opportunity. So they favored a less overt form of racism. And they put some things into motion that were designed to kind of level the playing field. But the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and the institution of affirmative action and active desegregation caused problems in white America by alienating the white masses. They were threatening white supremacy, and they were threatening white privilege. Understanding this, in 1968, during widespread riots, protests, and civil unrest, Richard Nixon became president by manipulating the racism of the white masses again. He created what's called the Southern strategy, where the Republican Party was secretly repackaged into the National White Party. That wasn't on TV, but in all those Christian evangelical churches, you can bet they were presenting themselves as the National White Party. When Ronald Reagan ran for president, Ronald Reagan was in California. He was governor of California. But when he announced his presidency, he announced it from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where those 3 civil rights workers had been killed, sending a signal that this is the National White Party, and the presidency that I established is going to look out for your interests. This strategy made the Republican Party the preference for the majority of Americans. They made liberal a bad word. Liberal actually means open and tolerant. But they made it a bad word. I guess that meant they were closed and intolerant. The Republican Party took over the country on all levels and elected Republican presidents for 28 of the next 40 years. From this point onward, the Republican ruling elites have retained power by catering to the racism of the white masses as a strategy for getting elected. And it all worked beautifully for years. It was beautiful. It worked beautifully. And then it didn't. And then it didn't. Since the 1950s, when the civil rights climate began to put pressure on the Jim Crow lifestyle, the Christian evangelical movement has been a big part of preserving white supremacy and white privilege. All you TBN and Daystar watchers know the roots of TBN and Daystar. They're in there wrapping Jesus up in the American flag. You think Jesus fought the Revolutionary War. The Christian evangelical movement is guided by a racist conservative vision of America. They are proponents of this thing you keep hearing, American exceptionalism. The belief that America has a special character and that it is gifted by God. It is more good, more just, and more righteous than any country on earth. And that it is actually infallible, that it can't be guilty of any moral wrong. That it is uniquely free and based on democratic ideals and personal liberty. They also believe that the founding fathers established America as a Christian nation, and that a white God and a white Jesus are the cornerstones of a pure white Christian American civilization. So first they built schools so their children wouldn't have to go to the desegregated schools. They built Christian schools. Then they organized politically to become the religious arm of the Republican Party through groups like the Moral Majority, the Christian Coalition, and Promise Keepers. They also built a white Christian counterculture that has actively worked to redeem American culture through a gigantic propaganda machine that includes books, radio shows, Christian television, Fox News, and Christian movies. They exist among us as a nation within a nation, seeking to fulfill their vision with missionary zeal. The ruling elites have played the race card for centuries to manipulate the white masses. They've done it for so long that they made a mistake. They've built up a large, angry, alienated class of white Americans raised on the promise of the American dream, the myth of white supremacy and American exceptionalism, and the habit of white privilege. They have created a monster. See, globalization and technology wiped out all the blue-collar jobs. So all these people that believe in white privilege and white supremacy who are supposed to live better than their fathers, they don't have jobs. And they're mad about it. And they're well armed. They're mad about it. Then in the height of their desperation, Barack Obama was elected as president. And they're mad about it. And they believe that all the things they're dealing with in their lives out there in the suburbs, becoming heroin addicts, comes from the fact that the jobs are gone and Obama is president. And they're mad about it. 60% of these people believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim. 80% believe he was not born in the United States. And now that the ruling class cannot deliver on the promise to give them a better life than their fathers, to meet their expectations, they are nostalgically longing for the good old days of affirmative action for white people. Their anger has made America ripe for the rise of a white supremacist demagogue, a messianic symbol for restoring their privileged position to get their country back and make America great again. Donald Trump is America's Frankenstein. He's America's Frankenstein. They messed up. These ignorant racists stopped listening to them and elected one of their own. And say he represents our interests more than anybody in the Republican establishment. Donald Trump's main promises are related to the shrinking white middle class, to their central fears. He said in his first 100 days as president, he's going to send the army to seal the Mexican border, even though there's nobody crossing it. Except to go home, Mexicans going back. He said he's going to construct a wall on the Mexican border. He said he's going to round up 10 million undocumented aliens and send them back overseas. And he's going to ban Muslim immigrants from coming into the country. And people said, that's my man. Today, the ruling elite's power position is in jeopardy because they've lost control of the white masters. The National White Republican Party has created a monster it can't control. The ruling elites and the Republican establishment have no control over what these angry, alienated, broken-hearted white Americans do. They have no control over their chosen leader. And by trying to stop him, they're likely to destroy themselves. They don't want him, and a lot of them are not going to support him. And those that do want him are likely to riot if he's not the party's nominee. They keep pointing out that he's not fit for the highest office in the land. But what they don't understand is his supporters don't care. They keep saying, this man lies incessantly. They don't care. They say he knows nothing about foreign policy. They don't care. They say he has none of the skills that it takes to run the country. They don't care. They don't care. They keep pointing out his weaknesses and his popularity goes up. Says what he doesn't know and his population goes up. Find out his university was a shield to rape money from people, and his popularity goes up. Find out he's a bad businessman, is in all kind of bankruptcy, and his popularity goes up. He could be caught in dead with a live boy or a dead girl, and his popularity would go up. He can't do any wrong. And he can't do any wrong because the one thing that he does represent is he represents the return of a white world order where a white man could be a dummy and a fool and still do better than his father. What was perceived as a privilege is now perceived as a right. A profound sense of entitlement makes white Americans feel that anything that blocks their realization of the American dream as an act of violence. So for us, these are dangerous times. The angry crowds gathering at Trump rallies are reflective of a widespread panic, anger, and fear that grips white America and that has suddenly become aware of profound changes occurring in their midst. Dr. Stephen Kleinberg of Rice University says, and I quote, "Houston has been transformed from a traditional southern town of whites and blacks to being the most diverse city in America. Anglos are having a hard time." That's white people. They're having a hard time. Rice University was established by and named after a slave owner. But today, white students are the minority. You have to be patient with us Anglos. We're really having a tough time. Unquote. They're having a tough time. A really tough time. And because they're having a tough time, they're dangerous. Where does the anger go when Donald Trump doesn't get elected? Studies have already been done that indicate the anger is going to go where it's gone before, into vigilante action of highly armed people who take out their frustrations on minority people that they think have sucked all the wealth out of the country, like over there in Charleston, South Carolina. Racist dinosaurs are fighting for the survival of their way of life. They know that they're becoming a minority in their own country, and they would like to preserve their privileged position and hand it down to their children. But ways of life, no matter how bankrupt, no matter how immoral, they do not die suddenly accepting that their time is up. They are terribly reluctant to pass away. They linger. Even when they're in the process of dying, many people, organizations, and regions of the country will still be bastions of the old order in the midst of the new. Civilizations die slowly. Even when it's obvious that a new day is dawning, the night does not easily release its grip. America is becoming a multicultural, multi-ethnic society that is growing irreversibly darker, younger, more diverse, and more tolerant. A new world is coming, but it's not here yet. There is a sizable old guard dedicated to a white world order and fighting to make the future look like the past. Our scripture says, "Do not be deceived. You cannot mock God. You reap what you sow." You reap what you sow is not simply a biblical scripture. It is a spiritual principle as old as religion itself, taught in the African mystery temples in the city of Memphis in ancient Egypt. It is one of the 7 universal laws. It's true everywhere, all the time. You reap what you sow. You cannot mock God. The world is put together a certain way. Certain things are true, certain things are lies. You can tell a lie a long time, but it will not stand, because truth crushed to the ground will rise again. You cannot build something in total contradiction to the divine order, in total opposition to divine truth, justice, and righteousness, and think that it's going to work forever. Sooner or later, you're going to reap what you have sown. The people who have created the construct of whiteness are now facing the boomeranging consequences. Chickens are coming home to roost. America has created a society built on a lie, steeped in a fantasy of self-made men who by sheer ruggedness, ingenuity, and hard work built the greatest country in the history of the world. Now that there are growing cracks in that myth, now that tremendous suffering of African slaves that fueled its financial growth has come into full view, now that the fact that America is built on the broken bodies of 20 generations of black people, now that there's a growing awareness that white privilege has always hinged on black oppression, now that many white Americans are beginning to live the experience that black people in this country have lived all along, now that the legacy to which they assumed they were heirs is increasingly beyond their grasp, now that the change in demographics have made many white Americans fearful of the future and fighting on the wrong side of history, they are cracking up. They can't deal with it. They're falling apart and having a nervous breakdown. MSNBC's anchor Chris Hayes said it best, and I quote, "This is starting to feel more and more like a long national nervous breakdown. For white America, I believe this is true," unquote. Kind of reminds me of a little story about Elijah on Mount Carmel. Remember the story? Got the 400 prophets of Baal out there in a contest, calling on God to throw down lightning bolts and send down fire to light this altar and show who is God. And so the 450 prophets of Baal get out there, and first they start praying. Then they start crying. Then they start hollering. Then they start dancing. Then they start cutting themselves and bleeding on top of it to show their loyalty and dedication. The problem with the whole thing, nothing happened to that altar. Nothing happened to it. Stayed just as dry and perfect. No fire ever came down. No lightning bolts ever came from the sky, because they were calling on a false god. Them people out there in the Trump rally, they can holler, scream, fight, cry, cut themselves, and bleed. White supremacy and white privilege was a lie when they told it. It's a lie today, and they're begging to a false god. But a real God got them reaping what they sown. A real God has unleashed a demographic tsunami, so that all the children being born in this country are children of color, and all the people that are dying are the people who call themselves white. A demographic tsunami is here, and it can't be stopped. That's what happened when you pray to and serve a real God. National identity rooted in whiteness is a dying proposition. Go ahead, God. Go ahead.